You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi there. I think this will be a little bit different episode. It's kind of a catch-up episode. There's so much that's been going on in current events that I want to comment on with whatever history I can bring to it. I'll record episodes at times and will sometimes intersect with exactly what's happening today and sometimes not. We did one on student loans and then look what happened, right, with student loans. That was kind of anticipated. But other episodes, like say the elephant in the room where we talked about former presidents, wasn't as much news going on with that topic, former presidents involved in politics, as there is at the current moment. So want to kind of catch up and discuss some of what's going on. Some of this is influenced by a visit I took recently to Washington, D.C. I really have to say there's something about being there in the symbols of the United States of America, the Capitol building, the White House, although I didn't see that on this particular visit, the judiciary, the older buildings, the white stone, and the green grass. And, it's hot there, I'll admit, in August. And I'm reminded of that old Portuguese diplomat that in the early 1800s said of the United States Capitol, it's a city of magnificent distances. He was not making a compliment. He was talking about how far it was to walk to everything. And when it's a hot day like that, you really noticed. But at the same time, it's majestic, having that Capitol dome behind you with the reflecting pools. And I think about where we are as a republic, and I'll talk a bit about these things today and also try to historicize them a bit. I want to start with a poem. I want to start with a poem that I was introduced to recently called July in Washington by Robert Lowell. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but parts of it. And it's written in 1964, and he captures this imagery. The stiff spokes of this wheel touched the sore spots of the earth. On the Potomac, swan-white power launches keep breasting the sulphurous wave. The elected, they come here bright as dimes and die disheveled and soft. We cannot name their names or number their dates. And then he says, we wish the river had this other shore, not the one we're on. And we wish that we could see this bright mountain chain that he compares to a girl's blue eyelid. But he says only the slightest repugnance of our bodies that we can't control anymore hold us back. July in Washington, Robert Lowell. I suggest you read it. It's online. He writes it in 1964. And I think you see in this poem, it kind of makes Washington this powerful city that controls all the different, as he says, it's a wheel that has spokes into all the parts of the earth. It's not always positive, hence all that sulfur he's talking about in the water. But yet when you see it, it's kind of this swampy land with a lot of vegetation. And he uses that in his poem. But he also talks about how this capital city sits in a swamp, and it would be nice if there was evident, some other shore, like an ocean or a mountain that the rest of America is. And it doesn't represent well. Well, I've talked about in the past about how they almost moved the capital to St. Louis, but that's not really Lowell's point either. It's just that this city and the power that it represents and the current American nation. And there's hints in this poem of corruption and not being as good as you could be. That line about elected people coming to the city, bright as dimes, like hard-nosed, moral people people with goodwill who are also strong. And then they come up with crumpled up clothes and, no good ideas and are corrupted by the system. He writes this in 1964, so all of this strikes me for a lot of reasons. One is, I don't know how many times I hear that we're in the worst time in America's history and no one's ever felt this way. No one's ever felt the chaos. No one's ever felt craziness, partisanship, depending on your point of view in one area or another, corruption, forces beyond our control that have taken our republic, This is written in 1964. And I'll talk a bit more about that time period later, but I think the thing you need to understand, the president of the United States had just been shot. On top of that, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War. It's an emergency time, nuclear missiles pointed at each other from two large nations. We're not communicating well with China nor Russia nor a host of other countries in their midst. And yet, we're told this is the worst, most scary time. And I just don't think that's the case. And I think this is at least one period that you can look at where Americans were freaked out. It's evident in Lowell's poem. It's also evident that there's the aspirational nature of America, what we want it to be, and then there's what it is. Doing battle in his poem, in his image about July in Washington and this kind of hot, swampy, vegetative city. He has another line in the poem about these statues look like South American liberators, with green grass growing on them. So there's always this sense that we have to keep the republic trim and good looking and do things as citizens to make it better, or else turns to sulfur. It all strikes me. It all strikes me very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about current politics than I usually do. My question to myself is, can I act like a political drone here, fly above my own biases? I might have. You have, we all have, and just look at the situation from above. Probably I can't, and probably none of us can, but I think we all have to try harder. We should have our partisan, utopian, this is right, I'm grabbing the steering wheel type thoughts. But we also should have a more educational side of us, a more parisha, where we can speak freely and about things without spear tipping every communication we make to our partisan sense, attacking, and that's what a lot of social media do. I think the character limit of Twitter alone leads us towards that. People make a few mistakes in general in their communications, as I see it. They're too forward partisan, everything in those terms. They all think the world is left, right, Republican, Democrat. If they're left, then the right is a scary troll. If they're right, then the left is a scary Leninist Trotsky dude. Well, people say in polls all the time that they're in the center of politics. When they envision their political opponents, they don't see much center. I think that's quite true. They're skeptical of divisions that exist in politics today, and put people into a few buckets and not enough. And don't realize that while their own minds might be, how they feel about things might be very individualistic, and they feel just strongly about it, that they are different from others, but when it comes to looking at other American minds, they do not. There's so many political divisions that you could look at in America today. It's not just left and right. You have kind of the real progressives. I want to do something. I want to change lots of things quickly. That type of left. You have a more establishment left that might be where you might put the president right now. A libertarian. Leave me alone. But also don't harm people type left. Take it easy on the rules. Take it easy on all the save us talk. The overused, say, never Trumper Republican types. I'm right. I will vote left when needed for safety against that type person. The more I'm registered as Republican, family always voted Republican. I'm more right than left. Take it easy on all the save us rhetoric. Take it easy on your utopian ideas. I might cringe at a few things I see written or said. I may or may not have voted for Trump in 2016 or in 2020. That type. You have people who are Trump absolutists. You have some libertarians. Let the free market decide. And then that'll work out. Get off my backs. Sometimes if the free market is saying that Trump should be the leader, okay. You have all of these kind of opinions. You also have a real authoritarian group that would be very strict, more like everything should be families. There should be strong rules around law and order. Let the families take care of things in America would be better. Reduce the size of government drastically. You have authoritarian left. They're like, we need extreme regulation of these businesses and what they're doing. Extreme redistribution of income. And when we had it in the 40s and 50s, America prospered. Highest corporate tax rate, and the average middle-class person prospered. These are all I'm just naming a bunch of different types of people who fit into various politics. And you win elections building coalitions of those people where you can. That's the reality of what goes on in politics. The fake of what goes on in politics is that there's two parties, and they're competing with each other. Or there's left and there's right. And you may be creative and have a whole bunch of others. I think there could be like 26 different definitions of types of politics that people could fit into. And they each feel very strongly about it. I can't claim to be an expert at this. I can claim a little historical knowledge on different divisions in the past. Like, for instance, when Lincoln was president. And then again, you could say, oh, there are only... a very basic interpretation. It was Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis in the Civil War. And then you start broadening it, and you have Lincoln. You have Unionist Democrats who are supporting the war but not supporting Lincoln or the way he's fighting it. You have moderate Republicans. You have radical Republicans, the Ben Wade and Zach Chandlers of the world, who did not like Lincoln one bit, or any of his approaches. You piece together what you can from these coalitions, and that's how Lincoln governed during that war. We didn't get to see what he'd do afterwards, but I think it would have involved piecing together coalitions of different people, because the radical Republicans had, despite all the salutes for him, almost had enough with Lincoln. This doesn't change over time. It's a republic, the United States, and to the republic for which it stands. Public, people, poly. And unlike the Athenians, we at least attempt here to have everyone to speak. See, the Athenians had a democracy that involved maybe 10% of the people. I had Dr. Paul Cartledge on a few years ago who was explaining how all that worked. It was a lot more democratic with the average person in the juries. But when it came to the running of Athens, it was a small group of people. We've never wanted that. We've, over time, wanted to enlarge that. And there's been definite battles, and still are, over how people vote and who gets to vote. But generally, the direction has been, you've gone from a system where, say, property owners could vote to something where everyone has a voice. And we want to enlarge that voice, vote both in the voting and in the speaking. But that's it. With a republic, you should be tolerant as a good citizen of a myriad of voices and want to hear them. Some of the left-right axis, that's all we ever hear, or some of the terms, some of the ways that you label people. It's hard sometimes because there are language limits. How do you describe things? You end up I use the terms left and right all the time for lack of something else. Language has its limits, but we do have to think out of the box on that. So we've had some recent events, haven't we? Warrant and search on President Trump's home at Mara Lago in Florida. The January 6th committee. The decision of Wyoming voters to send Congresswoman Liz Cheney home because of her work on that committee and other statements. Biden's student loan programs. Biden and the Democrats running in midterms. The Inflation Reduction Act. The topic of inflation, maybe a little de-inflation, maybe fears of reinflation, definite fears of upcoming recession, perhaps. And the general, this is a super hypercharged partisan time and it will never get any better tone. The January 6th committee, I believe, was necessary. I already talked about this on my congressional committee cast. That doesn't mean they got everything right. And if let's say the situation was this. If I witnessed a group of protesters who were seeking national health care, the enhancement of national health care, lower drug prices for Americans, like things that I would be very positive about. And if they came in bulletproof armor, bear spray, with advanced units ahead, breaking down barriers, attacking Capitol Police, getting into the Capitol, getting into Congresswomen and Congressmen's offices, getting into the Speaker's office, calling out the names of specific congressmen. If they were calling out, say, Josh Hawley to be able to detain him until they could give him a talk about national health insurance, I would be just as outraged as the events that happened. And more importantly than my little outrage, I would say this: it would deserve an investigation by the congressional body. You know, I mean, people do go in and out of the Congress all the time, and there are tours. It used to be quite an open door, as I recall, in the early to mid-90s. But this isn't what we're talking about here, are we? I would say that would require an investigation. So what happened with the January 6th committee, needed be say, was correct and right. And I'd also say, and you hear some talk about this, that there could be an investigation of the investigation should control of Congress take place. And that, I think, would be not only ridiculous, but an abuse of Congress, really, abuse of Congress's authority. It has the right, as a constituted Congress, to investigate things. And so I believe all of that. That being said, I found the J6 committee a little bit conclusion forward, if you ask me. I mean, I talked about that a lot in a historical context about how congressional committees have been. And the Kefauver Committee, for instance, yes, it brought to the nation's attention crime. Yes, it brought, say, an admission finally from the FBI that there was organized crime, which they were reluctant to do. They'd rather focus on, like, babyface whoever, big bank robbers and stuff, and say we nabbed the guy, and not say that there was this collective organized underworld. But Kefauver does that, but also at the expense of some. I mean, they're just kind of shouting accusations at people who probably did some bad things, but they don't really have the goods. And then, of course, the real wrong is when you get into McCarthy's committee and some of the things he's doing. A few times, a broken clock strikes twice, is right twice a day. Sometimes he hits a few things, but in general, he's throwing stuff against the wall and ruining careers. And this is what we don't want. You have bad examples of committees, and you have over the history a lot of times kind of fringe elements, like TV moments are the key elements of the committee. So I found it a little bit, and again, I go back to, I said it was warranted. They needed to do this work. They uncovered some things that I think were important. The most important was the testimony of actually people who are on the ground. I don't know. I mean, I do criticize things like showing Senator Hawley running in the hallway. Like, a congressional committee should not be an opportunity for things like that. I get it. It's hypocritical for someone to say, I don't need security, and then they're running. But is that the committee's job to do, or is that something that you can choose to release along with a lot of other things and let partisans on social media do that. I felt that sometimes it was a congressman or woman stating claims instead of just letting the witness and the testimony make those claims. Sometimes they had to do it because it's a lot of information and they were summarizing. But it was a television event, and that those are aspects where you can be critical of it while supporting the whole investigation. I think it was effective politically. I do believe that this will be one of several trends that just might make midterms a little different this year, and I'll get into that. The GOP, by deciding to protest this committee and not have members on it, gave up their opportunity to do what was done during the Watergate House committees, what was done during all of the Clinton House committees, where there were members of the Republican or Democratic Party in opposition, respectively, who could criticize the investigation right there in the committee, who could raise questions, and you didn't have that. I mean, perhaps it's a clever politics, right? Because the argument could be that by not being on that committee, you saved yourself the argument that that committee's a bunch of baloney. I see that possible play. If that was the strategy, I don't think it worked. I think the J6 committee was a lot more effective than that. Here's my historical hat back on. If I did make it clear in the committee cast, a committee now could be a committee tomorrow. They're made up of politicians, and they will be the same fights in reverse if the GOP takes over the House. Or, and I have to add, because I think this is increasingly a possibility, if the GOP is able to even have a successful speaker's election or able to really run that House consistently over time. We'll see what happens there. Liz Cheney lost her election in Wyoming. This is absolutely no surprise. Should not have been a surprise to her. A surprise would have been if she only, say, lost by 5 or 10 points in a Republican primary in Wyoming, having criticized Trump, who did extremely well in Wyoming. Primaries are not unlike congressional committees in this way. They create the veneer of elections, but it's important for us as political observers, if we're going to be serious about it, to see what they are. They're votes among people who are committed to one party or the other. They're toe the line. I mean, that's been their function since the beginning, really, since their start starting in the 1890s, in some ways for that exact purpose, to kind of enforce party discipline and make sure that a member doesn't get too far out of line voting against where the party's most rabid voters say are. And you've seen that scientifically perfected in 2022. I think primaries are really part of the reason, and the whole voting, winner-takes-all voting system combined with primaries are part of the reason for our politics today. There's some talk about Cheney running for president. Well, who knows, right? Anyone could do it. It's easier now than it ever has been with the internet and things like that. You don't have to hope for the Washington Post to talk about you a lot, although they are talking about Liz Cheney. And you hear some punditry that perhaps if she runs, so that would take away votes from Trump, and then Biden, Harris, or whoever is Democratic nominee at that point wins the election. Nothing could be further from the truth or the historical record. A third party will almost always hurt the party who is the incumbent party in the White House. And I'll add here, a serious third party. Almost always. You have 1992, 1968, 1912, 2016, just as some examples where there was a strong third party. There's still a refusal to acknowledge the role of third parties in 2016. It's so simple and so clear to me. Gary Johnson getting millions of votes, Jill Stein getting millions of votes, 500,000 write-in votes for President of the United States, the most ever in 2016. The more third-party candidates you have that are serious, that's indicative that people obviously didn't like the two-party candidates, that's first of all, but also that there's something wrong with the existing administration. There's enough to criticize that there could be two voices attacking, and then you have a whole campaign with two serious or more voices attacking. The only person that I can see in history that benefits from that third party running is Harry Truman in 1948. Still, a very nerve-wracking close election there. And I think it was a little different with the politics of the time because he had actually four parties. It was Wallace and the Progressives, Dewey and the Republicans, Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats, and Truman running. The Dixiecrats take southern states off the table that I believe that hurts Truman because he might have won them. Dewey probably wasn't going to get them. They didn't like Dewey any more than they liked Truman, all right, on the issue of civil rights. And then you have Wallace, the progressive, because he performed well in states where Dewey was also performing well, like New York is a big one of Wallace's best states. This is Henry Wallace we're talking about, not George. That comes later. Wallace also, so he helps Truman in that way. He also makes Truman appear more moderate than Truman actually was because he's got this guy that's like pinko left, according to the press, on his left. And it makes Truman look more in the middle, and that helped him with some voters. Usually that is not the case. Those are really hard dynamics to line up again. I think that anyone in the White House, you got a third-party candidate, what they will do is they will drain someone like a Liz Cheney would drain Republicans who would be voting for Biden or Harris and giving them another choice. Now, it's going to depend with any third party on how serious they are. What chance do they have? You saw in the 1980 election, you saw in the 1996 election that where the challenger, say Perot or Anderson, doesn't seem to have a credible chance to even get to, say, the House of Representatives in a deadlock or something, voters start bailing on them towards the end. So polls are going to be important here. Anderson had something like 25% of the people would have voted for him, but 6% do, because they don't want to waste their vote. And that's going to happen, too, as you get to an election. That usually that process favors incumbents. But this whole idea that, Cheney could run as a third party, that'll sink Trump, I don't understand that commentary. They'd have to explain it to me. Student loans. So the announcement that Joe Biden had his plan with the $10,000 in forgiveness in student loans set up the same debate that we talked about in our episode. We were timely with this episode. Fortunately, whether you're giving away something where other people worked hard for it or whether we're all, as I might see it, have a stated view of supporting education generally. It's one of the highest things in the polls, and doing it this way, I don't know if it's because it feels too retro, like the people already spent the money instead of giving people a scholarship now, all of a sudden we don't want to do it. I think in the way that Joe Biden did it, he had floated the idea of 10K, so the fact that he just announces 10K, really question the politics there, but that's not up to me. I think, you're supposed to, under-promise, over-deliver or something like that, right? I would have thought if you floated something, it would be bigger to make a bigger announcement before midterms. But I also see in this thinking, so the average student loan debt is about $25K, and there's lots of people with more. 10K, that might help a few people who are close, but what you're talking about is just some palliative amount. Most people are still going to have loans. So all this talk, they're going to go run up and take extra classes now because they got 10K paid. I don't see it. It's an exact kind of moderate kind of policy that a lot of people on the left of things are going to call milquetoast because what are you really doing, right? There is more to the legislation. You really have to look at the repayment improvements, which are going to be income adjusted. That helps people a lot. That's probably more important than the 10K, which is getting all the press and all the debates. Midterms are turnout battles. So doing something like this, you see President Biden timing things towards the midterm in a way that I haven't seen as much in other areas. Let's see. Now that I haven't seen in other presidencies. I don't think student loans drives huge turnout. It's probably just one of many factors. Roe v. Wade is a bigger one. And here I've really thought about this, and I think the historical example with Roe v. Wade, I see a connection to prohibition, which was this great moral crusade that in the end was really supported by a small, very, very active, very good at fundraising, very good at political persuasion group of people, but not broadly by Americans. And it got worse each year after it was enacted. After they won, politically, many people were sorry that they won and went with a kind of lax enforcement as a way around the issue. Because it was a difficult issue. If you spoke out against prohibition, you were supporting drunks. You were showing yourself of low moral character, which is hard for any politician of any party. And so you had this lag throughout the 20s where people are experiencing increases in crime, pissed off constituents, to be frank, about not being able to do something they wanted to do, and that they felt they were adults and could manage themselves, and also low sales tax revenues, where this is a key instrument for a lot of cities. And by the time you get to the Depression, that last argument is much bigger than anything and is what really kills prohibition. So I see this kind of like an equatable issue. One of the things about prohibition is that there were many states where Democrats and Republicans together were getting annoyed by this issue because it cut across lines. You had wet Republicans, wet Democrats, you had dry Democrats and dry Republicans, and these prohibitionists could kind of operate within their parties. And so political bosses, maybe not everyone's favorite person to listen to their grumblings about, didn't always like what was going on. And I would predict the same thing with Roe v. Wade, even though it's mostly a Democrat versus Republican issue. You're starting to see some of that break now that you have actual prohibition. And I think you saw the vote in Kansas. That's not a very blue state. They can win a statewide election sometimes. They have a Democratic governor. But you saw what happened in popular reaction. We just don't have enough evidence about midterms. I'm going to do a couple casts about midterms, going to rerun one from 2018. I'm also going to do one on Nixon's so-called lonely midterm of 1970, his only midterm, and try to get at it. But the reality is there's too low a sample size for me to tell you what's going to happen with the midterms. And can a president actually not lose seats during a midterm? It's just too low of a sample size. And the examples that are like where a president didn't lose any kind of significant amount or gain, they're small. It's hard to put them into boxes. But you do have 1962, and you do have 2002 and 1998 and 1934, where a couple of things happened that are occurring today, and a couple of things aren't occurring today. Okay? The key thing is there was a big, broad political movement. In the case of 1962 and Kennedy, it was because it was right after the relief that occurred after the Cuban Missile Crisis and a belief in Kennedy's leadership after that. In 2002, 1934, and 1998, it was a big political movement that countered what usually is like disgruntled base of a president's party. With 1998, it was the impeachment, and people felt wrong on that, and Democrats came out and voted. In 2002, it was after 9/11, and the issue of whether to go to war or not in Iraq, and the Patriot Act, and much hay being made of Democrats being, say, unpatriotic because they weren't convincingly supporting this Patriot Act. 1934, New Deal, Depression, Roosevelt's popular programs. But in those three elections, you had high popularity at the time with the presidential incumbent. And you're just not seeing that, Biden. I mean, It ticked up a little in August. He's at 44, according to Gallup, where his lowest ever was 38. His highest ever was 57. 44% is not overwhelming and would seem a reversal of a midterm trend make. So we're left with this kind of like, we don't know what's going to happen, but you see things going on, though, with this Roe v. Wade issue where after the victory, the victors may have some buyer's remorse or parts of them. This is exactly what happened to the Republican Party in the 20s. So you have numerous kind of breakaways or silent breakaways. Calvin Coolidge was never a big supporter of prohibition, just on paper, not on enforcing it. He almost gets a primary challenge in 1924 because of this, when Big Bill Thompson becomes mayor of Chicago. He doesn't say, I'm against prohibition. They're all supporters of prohibition on paper in the 1920s if they're Republicans. What he does say is, we're not going to look under every citizen's bed in Chicago. As it turned out, if the liquor establishments and distributors paid him well enough, he was fine looking the other way. That was Bill Thompson. And that was very common in 1920s, how this overwhelming moral issue was handled when the restriction came before most people agreed with it. Well, Bruce, it's only talking about, I do understand it's a little different because there's a state by state restrictions, but many states have legislatures that are gerrymandered and don't reflect the ultimate popular vote in that state, and they're passing laws such as that. The other thing I'd say is that it is true that this is more state by state at the current time. It's still an issue that's important at the federal level because there hasn't been statutory rights established at the federal level. So it's still a federal battle. This is not just an issue of the states, regardless of what the SCOTUS said. And then thirdly, I'd say we're more aware of other states now than we are. We're more aware of the national picture, the average citizen is, because of the media and the internet that we have. So even a restriction on people in one state, can be a big issue for others. Well, we'll see what happens. FBI served a warrant on Trump's Mara Lago for classified documents. Where do I come down on it? It's right to take it seriously. It's right to look at it. It's right to be even a wee bit concerned that you have presidential candidate. I think, and before I get slammed by folks that don't like Trump, I just want to say that, remember, whether it's those congressional committees or you're talking about something like the FBI or the Department of Justice, you don't have to look back too far to see that it could be under someone else's control at another point. And so what you want to have are these institutional limits. So it really comes down to the process that we're going through now, a public discussion and release of some documents. I do think I would go as far as to say there is a higher need than in other criminal cases, say, and other investigations to publicly discuss what's going on when it involves a live presidential candidate who has stated that they are one. This was a big problem in 2016 with what Comey did with Hillary Clinton, because although he kind of botched it in the statements that he made and was clumsy about the whole thing, there was all of a sudden a reopening of the investigation a few weeks before the election. And there was a lack of awareness in the news story that creates and the effect on politics. In this regard, I can't help but raise the Trump-DeSantis dynamic, because you have a situation where Ron DeSantis says, hey, it's not a raid that occurred. It's somewhat defending the warrant search without really doing it. You're going to see this thing go on now for a little bit until this is hashed out. This is a political bodysuit of sorts. They're both residing in Florida. That's going to make that Florida primary critical, and someone like a DeSantis would need that to launch his campaign, and is going to have trouble winning there with Trump still in the race. But it's really not about any one primary. He can't go on and launch until he's aware of where Trump is in this race. And this is what I talked about in the Elephant is in the Room podcast, is that a former president creates a big black hole in the politics of a party until they make it clear whether they're running or not. And once they say they're running, then you have a situation where you can start to attack them like any other candidate if you're so inclined. But you also have a situation where a lot of people are going to be getting out of any active challenge because A, they don't want to take on a former incumbent, and B, they might want to be a vice presidential candidate at this point. Take your 4 or 8 years close to the president instead of running against him and possibly getting nothing. So this DeSantis thing, you see, I thought this would happen, that there might be a candidate that was not Trump, but not necessarily disagreeable to all his supporters either, that would emerge. Like, somebody like a Romney or a Cheney running in a Republican primary. I mean, we know where that's going to go. They're going to get 10, 15% and out. I mean, maybe they'll get a little more with some of the news that's come out and things like that. Depending on what Trump does or doesn't do. They might get a little more than that. But in a Republican Party primary, someone of that ilk is probably done. So DeSantis is different. I do think that some of his name recognition comes from, the news channels, Fox does have candidates that they favor at times. They completely did this with Chris Christie in 2012, where it's like, we're going to offer you good coverage kind of thing. We're going to have you on a lot. You have to speak well and you have to do it yourself, but we're going to have you on a lot, which in and of itself is a good thing for a candidate. They seem to be doing this with DeSantis. You have that. You also have kind of his, on this side of politics, the heroism over COVID restrictions and not doing them in a sense, and standing up to things like that in that world is a positive. But I think some of the expiration date on that, I mean, we're getting, it's not COVID's not gone, but we're getting far away from where any government's going to look at those restrictions. And it was, in the view of many people, an emergency restriction for an emergency time. You have things like vaccines, and you have some immunization, and you have some better practices, and the disease is taking different forms. Absent that, he's lost a major issue that was his campaign issue. So, however, he remains governor. Governors are very strong in presidential elections in American history. We like to elect governors. They can show that they're an executive. They can make news by getting their legislature to pass things. They have to be in control of their legislature, or else it doesn't work. DeSantis is. So you have some powerful things there. I just think, unfortunately, that Trump-DeSantis thing is going to have to be worked out, or you're going to end up with a pretty bloody primary that won't be advantageous to either of them. I don't comment a lot. I'm certainly not the RNC political director. Pretty far from that. Straight up politics, straight up votes. No, not talking about any consequences or anything like that. If I were in their shoes, I'd run Trump. Much better name. I think he polls turnout that while DeSantis may not show up high on a poll or two, or I think you get unpredictable turnout from Trump when he runs in the places where you need it. So, seems stronger candidate, but then you're going to have to deal with consequences that come with that. One of which is, if you want to have any kind of Republican Party and have values or platforms, if that's what you want, you're not going to get it unless he agrees with it. You're going to basically get a Trump Republican Party. He's been influential in primaries, so he's already seeming to indicate that this is the direction he wants to go. There's a couple of things I see out here. So I have one, when I look at Biden and Trump, there are two things that are under the radar that I believe are bad points for both of them. So to be somewhat balanced, I'll share one bad one for Biden, one bad one for Trump that I don't think most political observers are talking about. So for Biden, I think, he thinks he can turn it around kind of in the last few months of a midterm. And you have seen gas prices come down. You have seen some, say, de-inflation, I'm going to call it, because it's not deflation. That's something else. It's actually not good either, by the way. It's even a lot worse than inflation when prices start dropping like crazy. But he's kind of forgetting that voters have impressions that may not change before October. 1992 is a great example of this. That when the economy was actually getting better by any measure in the late 1992, right as voters were going to the polls, you started to see GDP growth creeping up where it had been down. And you were coming out of that 1990 crisis. It didn't matter. Voters still had stories of their friends being laid off, of them being laid off in some cases, and just having a hard time finding work, and the economy generally being bad. It didn't feel good. That doesn't go away in a few months, and that's something that I think they should be aware of. Here's the other thing. Let's say gas prices go down to $2 a gallon or something. That might help, but it's not going to be that much. And voters over history have not rewarded presidents for good gas prices either. It's only when prices are high that they complain. They don't give you points when you get prices down. So I think there's an issue for him. For Trump, I think something that's under the radar and, that I've noticed is he's a person that, his pitch was business leader. I haven't seen the management experience in that. Too many former employees, more than any president that I've ever seen, have come out and are speaking out against him. So it's not just people who are critical. It's anyone who's worked in, not everyone. There are a group of loyalists, and we get that. But there are a great number of people who have worked in that White House who, after their terms ended, I'm thinking of Mike Esper, the defense secretary, just one of the most recent ones. I'm thinking of Bill Barr, who was a real Trump partisan, really giving him a lot of legal credibility during his time there, and now saying terrible things. John Bolton. These are just a few. And how can you not judge a person's leadership by that? I think it's completely fair to do so. What's the argument on the other side? They're going to say it's kind of like deep state, these people, because you can't write a book and be pro-Trump. If you write a book anti-Trump, you make a lot of money. You get on the talk shows, things like that. I guess that's the argument against it. I just think it's more than any other president that I've seen. You had a couple with Bush. Bush's press secretary came out against him and had a kind of a nasty book. You had his first Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, come out in a big way against George W. Bush. Not just about policy, but also about his intelligence and things like that, and how much Cheney was running the show and things like that. But I just haven't seen the level of it since then. As I said, I was in Washington, D.C., right behind that Capitol dome. Made me a little philosophical, thinking about our republic and just keeping in mind that a republic works when everyone speaks, when we hear voices, when we consider other voices. It doesn't work as well when there's a shutdown of voices. And that includes not just institutionally, like the Twitter or whatever, but it also in ourselves, if we're not listening, that there could be another point of view. When we just go out there with spear tips, as I see a lot of rhetoric and a lot of social media, it's just attack first. We're not learning. Lyndon Johnson once said, I never learned anything by talking. Of course, he talked a lot, but, still his aphorism is true there. I'm reading a lot of Richard Rorty recently, Achieving Our Country. I'm always influenced by that point of view. Not that he's right on everything, but it's just a kind of viewpoint that, you do actually have to like America to be part of a country. We have to be aspirational. We have to want this to work. You must be there instead of the other way, just being always cynical, sarcastic, ironic. Oh, there's powerful forces that we'll never beat, and that's it. That's not, as he says, achieving our country. On the other hand, in contrast to that, I was reading recently some of Michel Foucault, French philosopher whose word he's not a huge fan of, but who had a quote that was something of the effect like, we know what actions we want to take, and we know what the results will be generally from them. We think we know what's going to happen when we take a certain action. But we can never be aware as humans. We don't have the vision to be aware of all the consequences of it. So, you go and drink a bottled water and what happens to the bottle? That's a really simplified example of probably recycling better in that industry than anywhere. But that's kind of what Foucault's saying. So you have those two, the contrast and the tension between those two viewpoints of, first of all, we have to be better because it's the only way to be. And secondly, to really simplify it, there's too many forces that are too big that you can't possibly control. So why bother? Just find what's wrong, identification of what's wrong, and at some hope for justice there that way is the only thing you can do. And that's constantly, that's what's going on in our politics, that tension between these two things expressed by these two very different people without most people knowing that or having read either one of them. And I cannot get away from that. I do think when I look at the Capitol Dome and the buildings, and I, reference that Robert Lowell poem about how the vegetation kind of growing over the city, and it can be corrupt, and it can be these place with these old statues and sulfur water, with confused wildlife, and yet being so detrimental to the rest of the world, like kind of this like dystopian Cold War vision of Washington, D.C. and what America is and has done to the world. But I also think as a democracy, there's reason to be optimistic. Look at all the people who have come and gone. I'll just read a few names like George W. Bush, Cheney, Kerry, Quayle, John Boehner, Gingrich, Bill Clinton. These are big names who once influenced a lot and in our lifetimes and in a lot of countries. These guys would have incredible power still, and they do not. All those names I mentioned, they're not in control of anything other than their speaking schedule, say. Like I said, in a lot of countries, you might be 10 years is nothing for some countries. For a recent podcast coming up on 1970, and I hadn't realized this, I found that Muammar Gaddafi, he had taken over Libya in 1970. What a long reign he had. We're better. We don't have what I joked with Professor Paul Cartledge, who talked about Athens, that we might like. We don't have what Athens had, which is exile. If the people vote, you just simply take troublesome politicians and move them away. But we have a form of it. We move on and we move to new things. But the argument against all that might be, well, that's great, Bruce, but I'm scared by these new things. I'm scared by them. And I can only historicize that in this way, that was often the case. And I'm going to read a bit from a paperback I'd just gotten into, which is Norman Mailer's Presidential Papers. It's written right before the Kennedy assassination, so it's a group of letters that he wrote to President Kennedy. But really, they're just his articles. He didn't actually send anything to Kennedy, or he wasn't in the administration like that. But it gives you a sense of that time, and I'm talking about the 62, 63, and how American feelings were. And I find it a very anxious, very partisan, very hyper kind of time. And if the argument is that because of all the information being thrown at us, like everything's fast moving now, even that, I'm afraid to say, is not new, my friends. That is something, wow, in 1980, I was doing research for the Reagan podcast, and there was all of this, 1981, and so all of this talk about now things are too fast because of all the computers and all the stuff being thrown at us. And you read that, too, in what Norman Mailer writes, and so I'll read a bit of it. Since the First World War, Americans have been leading a double life, and our history has moved on two rivers, one visible, the other underground. There's been the history of politics which is concrete, factual, practical, and unbelievably dull, if not for the consequences of the actions of some of these men. And there is the subterranean river of untapped, ferocious, lonely, and romantic desires, that concentration of ecstasy and violence, which is the dream life of the nation. The 20th century may yet be seen as that era where civilized man and underprivileged man were melted together into mass man. The iron and steel of the 19th century giving way to the electronic circuits, which communicated their messages into men. It could be argued that the impetus to America's Cold War with communism has come from a collective psychosis, from a monster which has borne almost no relation to the objective Cold War going on in these years, particular real Cold War, which has been concrete, limited, ugly, derailed, and shrewd in its encounters. The Russians had showed a tough, tenacious, sly, somewhat dishonorable, and never-tiring regard for local victory, in each of their episodes with us. We have dealt with this international opposition in terms which were schizophrenic. Here's a poem he writes to President Kennedy. You realize, of course, Mr. President, that your shelter program for every homeowner is sexing up the countryside and killing us in the big city bar. If this is good for the vitality of the nation, then, Mr. President, you are a genius, and the corporate executives living in the suburbs with their $5,000 shelters ought to salute you. I do. Atom bombs are not so bad, says small time in the town mind. They disinfect the big city and jazz us the toes out here in God's country. While big city flesh, all that blonde hair and black hair, straight and long, short and highly curled, floating in through the trees, a dew of homogenized bone and blood mist. We lie about the communists. They lie as well. We deaden the life of millions by hypocrisy and go on to claim we are the hope of civilization. They liquidate the life of millions and argue they are the imagination of the future. Of course, it may not be agreeable to listen to this now. America has been passing through a period of enormous expansion since the war. The double 4 years of Dwight Eisenhower could not retard the expansion. It can only denude it of color, character, and the development of novelty. The small-town mind is rooted. It is rooted in the small town. And when it attempts to direct history, the results are disastrously colorless. Because the instrument of world power, which is used by the small-town mind, is the committee, and committees do not create, they merely proliferate. America's need in those years was to take an existential turn, to walk into the nightmare, to face into that terrible logic of history, which demanded that the country and its people must become more extraordinary and more adventurous, or else perish, since the only alternative was to offer false security in the power and the panacea of organized religion, family, and the FBI. Norman Mailer. A plague is coming named virus YSX, still unsolved, promises to be proof against antibiotics, psychoanalysis, research products, vitamins, awards, crash programs, crash diets, symposiums, foundations, rest, rehabilitation, tranquilizers, aspirin, surgery, brainwashing, lobotomies, rises in status, box office bofo, perversions, and even a good piece of, when that unhappy day comes to America, let the Russians take over. The best defense is infection. Norman Mailer. I want to take a couple questions. Al Mendelson had mentioned to me, did anyone ever figure out what the Tombstone scandal was? So in the episode about Tilden and the Tilden-Hayes election and how Tilden used a number of the scandals during the Grant administration. I never got the full story on that. And Al Mendelson asked that. Thanks, Al. I never got the full story on that, but I did see a slight newspaper article on it. So the Tombstone contract scandal was a scandal over the contracts for the marble for soldiers' graves, and that essentially, ostensibly through because of a bribe, a contractor was paid way too much. A contract was given to a Mr. Bridges of Keokuk, Iowa, for $900,000. Almost $1 million for American marble of very inferior quality and without any advantage to the government. Bridges' bid was put in after the hour fixed for opening the bids, after 2 of his own had been opened. This is another contractor who didn't get the bid, said that he was also favored to the extent of $75,000 after the assignment of the bid. And this was all examined by the Committee of Washington, the Committee on Military Affairs of the Congress, hearing from Maurice Walsh of New York, who said his bid for first-class marble was lower and he didn't get the bid. So that is the Tombstone contract, and it was a scandal you just don't hear a lot about. Look, you don't hear a lot about the anti-Grant scandals. I think the modern history is kind of washing that away because correctly, Grant, they're celebrating that he did a lot of good things, but they're not looking at some of the scandals of his administration, which people at that time definitely would have, and that's be they from the North or the South, a Democrat or a Republican. It was a big issue at the time. We'll talk more about it. I plan to do more on Grant. I also want to note that on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics discussion group on Facebook, we got a great discussion there. Eric Bacchus has a lot of good stats and figures and makes some convincing arguments about the cost of college. And rather than get into it on air, I'll just refer you to that excellent Facebook site, and we're going to do some thread rescue to be sure it's up. So go to the Facebook site, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics discussion group. We've got 1.6, we've got 1,600 members there, probably a couple hundred or so that are active. And, but you can discuss things about the podcast or ask a question or suggest things on Facebook. So find us there. And I'm going to rescue that thread so it's at the top because you really got to see some of his extensive research on college pricing. But here's what we agree on. You can't just look at the loan issue without looking at what happened to drive the cost of college up from when it was kind of a minor thing when Claiborne Pell started those grants to now. Here's David Sedley writes me, Bruce, I've listened to your podcast, which was featured on the Everything Everywhere podcast feed. Excellent information. Great how you put things into context. He was listening to Visions of a Fever, the 1941 podcast. However, I feel you left out an important detail when you spoke about Gerald Nye. We spoke about Nye and his committee looking into the origins of the war, World War I. He thought that the bankers and then Hollywood were responsible for dragging the U.S. into the war. But equally importantly, then as now, both banking and Hollywood were euphemisms for Jewish people. He was an anti-Semite, and then as now, isolationism often goes hand in hand with anti-Semitism. Thanks, David. Thanks, David. I guess I suspect there's some reading between the lines that folks have to do. I did want to point out that he shifted in 41 to Hollywood after having made most of his bread and butter on attacking bankers for a decade, and really world bankers, which in the 30s, yes, absolutely. When you talk about world bankers, you're not talking about the guy in Main Street anymore, and you're using a euphemism that could be anti-Semitic. Appreciate the listen, and I'm glad that Gary's Everything Everywhere podcast brought you to us. Hope that you've stayed. Let's see. Andrew L. contacted me. Hello, long-time listener, first-time writer. I was having a conversation with a friend about our representative in the House, and we both dislike him, and we asked about his 2022 opponent. My friend had met the opponent and had many nice things to say. Very personable, very fun to talk to if you get a few drinks in him. Very civically minded and sharp. And yet he continued, if elected, the civic-minded opponent would be a reliable backbencher for all the policies I hate. So my friend intended to vote for the incumbent that he disliked, but was of his party. This pseudo-parliamentary voting strategy, voting entirely based on party and who will be speaker, majority leader, seems to me like it is historically unusual. My impression is that split-ticket voting was common and expected for most of the nation's history, but is becoming less so, possibly due to power being particularly centralized in the hands of the speaker. Are there other periods of history where this voting behavior was common? What insight can history shed on the outcomes of treating our legislatures like it's a parliamentary democracy? Thanks. Thanks, Andrew L. Much appreciated. It's a great question. I just don't think voters in most cases do this in American elections, that we do have a lot of party-minded voting, and it's turnout of which base or the other that determines House elections, and also extreme computer-decided gerrymandering that determines House elections, and that's just a fact. So that there isn't a real race in most races. They can't gerrymander all of the House races, but there's just enough where that are swing elections. So that for that reason, I think most people are either they're voting by party, they're often voting because of the president that they support, the policies that they support, and it's not so much a thinking of who's going to be speaker. I do believe that you had cases like in the 1980s where there was a very split ticket. And in fact, for a lot of American history, because Democrats had the Congress from the time of television to the time of the internet, from 54 to 94, you had a Democratic Congress. You had a lot of this split voting during that time, but it wasn't always the case. I mean, the New Deal Congresses under Roosevelt were tremendously Democratic while he was a Democratic president. And then if you look at the last two Democratic presidents, Biden and Obama, you had both a Democratic House and Senate with a Democratic president. Same thing happens with Clinton in his first 2 years. So really the last three Democratic presidents at least started with Democratic Congress. They just couldn't keep it. And in the case of Biden, he doesn't have everybody on board for everything he wants to do. And that's just simply the case. I will point out some specs of this idea. You have some Democratic conservatives in the 1980s, like Charlie Stenholm of Texas, who threatened to run against Tip O'Neill to speaker in order to show his voters that he was separate and independent. You weren't voting for Tip O'Neill when you voted for him. I'm going to go in there and run against him, And then Gene Taylor, a Democrat who later became a Republican anyway, in the early 2000s, he promised not to vote for Pelosi if he was elected in 2010. And then he lost anyway. And then he ran as a Republican in 2014. He was running in Mississippi as a Democrat, so it was very hard for him to deal with the speaker issue. But in most cases, I think that those are the only cases where the speaker comes up. They tried to do this in 82 against Tip O'Neill, and in 1996 and 1998 against Newt Gingrich to transform these speakers into the opponent. And I guess it somewhat worked for Clinton in 96 and 98. When you get to the 19th century, a lot of the voting is on tickets, and you drop the ticket into the ballot box. So you're not having a lot of opportunity to split vote the way you can with the modern machines. And you could, though, in most states, cross out a name you didn't want to vote for, write someone in some cases. But that's what you'd have to do, which made it more difficult. I think your friend could be justified in this parliamentary voting. Like, no matter how nice the guy is, the speaker over time has been granted such power over the years as, for instance, the ability to recognize or not recognize legislation and move it forward. Plus, they get the majority of seats on the Rules Committee, and rules wrap around every piece of legislation, which means they control the speaker, and the speaker's influencers, say, control the House completely in a much greater degree than the majority leader controls the Senate. So they're kind of justified in a way. I just don't think most Americans are thinking about who is going to be speaker. Thanks for listening. So this one's going back, but I didn't realize this. What we talked about on the Lincoln Train podcast at the beginning of 2021 about Lincoln's trip to the inaugural from Springfield. And I talked about all the different towns that he stopped in, and one of them I said, Chile, New York. Well, it's not Chile, New York. It's Chile, New York. And if I had a dime for every time I pronounce town places wrong, it's very difficult, you know. I mean, I know that some of the places I'm familiar with in New Jersey, like Forked River, everyone would pronounce Forked River if they saw it. And if I ever saw it in another state, I'd probably say, oh, that's Forked River. But in New Jersey, it happens to be Forked River. We have another town that's in Spanish, which has rules of pronunciation, should be Buena, but it's pronounced Buna. It happens. So it is Chile, New York, that Lincoln went to, passed through, and not Chile, New York, as I had said. Sorry about that. With that, it's a long one, but I'm glad I got some points out. I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Thanks a lot.